Welcome to the debate. Today, we're really digging into a core tension within the psychology of achieving our goals, and it's all about positive thinking. We're constantly told to visualize success, to use affirmations, to just fundamentally believe. But the real question is, where does that mindset stop helping and, well, maybe even start to become a hurdle?
Right.
So the central intellectual challenge for us today is this. Is positive thinking, robust visualization, unwavering optimism, is that the sufficient psychological engine you need to fuel success? Or is it, in fact, an insufficient, maybe even deceptive, distraction that lets fantasy get in the way of, the rigorous, realistic planning that's necessary? Today, I'll be arguing that this belief system really is the essential and sufficient psychological core for any major achievement.
And I'll be arguing that while optimism is a great starting point, relying on positive thinking alone is, well, it's deeply insufficient and potentially harmful. Success isn't just about the vision. It demands a real commitment to behavioral realism, to strategy, and a clear-eyed view of the obstacles ahead. You need the map just as much as you need the fuel.
So my core claim here is that positive thinking is in fact psychologically sufficient to sustain the action and the persistence you need for big goals. And that's because it fundamentally changes how we perceive and interact with reality itself.
Okay.
To really get this, we have to look at the psychological machinery at play. When a person generates and holds this really strong positive vision of their future, they are in effect priming their own brain. This involves something called the reticular activating system, the RAS, which it basically acts as a neurological filter. So if you genuinely believe an outcome is possible, your RAS starts filtering the just overwhelming amount of sensory data coming at you, and it allows you to spot opportunities, connections, people that a skeptical or neutral mind would just automatically filter out. They'd miss it completely.
So it's about what you're attuned to.
Exactly. This isn't abstract. It's a functional change in cognitive processing. If I'm convinced that a partnership opportunity is, around every corner, my RAS is tuned to conversations, to market signals, to events all related to that. The person who's thinking, this goal is probably impossible, they just see noise, not opportunity. And we even see this demonstrated powerfully in medicine. The placebo effect proves, without a doubt, that belief can alter physical and mental reality. A positive expectation doesn't just feel good, it operates as a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when setbacks happen, and they always do, studies show optimists are way more likely to see failure as temporary, as external, and that makes them persist. Without that foundational belief, that engine, any action you take is going to be hesitant, half-hearted, and at the end of the day, insufficient. The belief system generates the stamina to overcome reality's resistance.
I come at this from a very different place, one that's more rooted in, let's say, verifiable outcomes rather than just internal comfort. And look, you make a compelling case for the necessity of motivation, and I agree, you can't start without a wish. But I have to stress that motivation is not a substitute for strategy. Optimism is not a shield against objective reality. The specific danger of relying only on positive thinking is that it encourages what behavioral psychologists call the planning fallacy. This is a really dangerous and very robust tendency to just dramatically underestimate the time, the costs, and the risks that come with any complex future action. We want the goal so badly that our brain tricks us into thinking the path is easier than it really is.
Okay, but give me a concrete example.
Sure. Let's take an aspiring author. They're visualizing themselves holding their best-selling book. And that's inspiring, I get it. But if they rely on that vision alone, they fall right into the planning fallacy. They estimate, it'll take 6 months to write, 2 weeks to edit, and then a major publisher will just snap it up. They totally fail to account for, the year of painful revisions, the market research needed, the emotional toll of rejection, or even the basic necessity of outlining. The visualization becomes a pleasant fantasy that replaces the uncomfortable, difficult work of preparation.
I see.
And so the overly positive person might just ignore the warning signs. Let's say a 40% rise in printing costs or a dip in their market because They're just so convinced, oh, it'll all work out. They keep pouring time and money into a flawed plan driven purely by belief. In this context, positive thinking it's a fantastic condiment. It really enhances the meal, but if you try to eat it as the meal as the primary source of effort, you will ultimately starve.
That condiment analogy is, it's provocative. But it makes me wonder about all the times when the strategy isn't enough, when the plan needs that engine to get through the rough patches that always come up.
Fair enough.
I think the core difference here really hinges on how we define endurance and how we interpret early data. I absolutely acknowledge positive thinking isn't passive. It's a mental directive towards action. But I still maintain that the belief has to come first, and it has to sustain the action through adversity. If a person is just constantly focusing on potential pitfalls, if they let negative feedback dominate their thinking, they're so much more likely to pivot too early or to self-sabotage or just abandon the ambitious goal for something smaller and safer. And that's the fundamental problem with a purely realistic approach. It breeds hesitation.
I'm not sure I'd call it hesitation. I'd call it prudence.
But that prudence can be paralyzing. Positive thinking gives you the emotional resilience to see setbacks, like, say, early financial losses for a startup or harsh critique of a draft, not as reasons to quit, but as solvable problems. It reframes fear into productive excitement. When the data looks bleak, the optimist asks, okay, what did I learn here that can solve this? The pessimist asks, wasn't this failure inevitable all along? It's that psychological state that lets a person keep generating high-quality effort, especially when the initial data is discouraging. The belief justifies the effort.
But if your engine of positive belief just leads to inefficient persistence, aren't you merely encouraging a painful, prolonged failure?
I don't think so, because
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Defining success only as persistence completely ignores efficiency and the ability to pivot. Persistence without a rigorous, realistic strategy is just, as I said, running in circles. You're wasting finite resources, your time, your capital, your emotional energy. The overly positive entrepreneur who sees every negative market signal as just a solvable problem instead of a warning that demands a radical pivot, they risk falling prey to the sunk cost fallacy. Their belief system keeps them emotionally chained to a bad strategy just because they've already invested so much. They ignore the fundamental facts, convinced their internal conviction will magically override reality.
But you're assuming
We have to acknowledge that the hard work and the planning must be faced with realism, not wished away. If the strategy is fundamentally flawed, if the product doesn't meet a market need, no amount of positive visualization is going to save that venture. It'll only prolong the inevitable and often more devastating failure. The real failure there isn't a lack of belief, it's a failure to process objective external data.
But you assume that the interpretation of objective data is itself objective. I disagree. When a challenge comes up, how you interpret that data is filtered through your belief system. For the person who believes they can succeed, an early loss is just a piece of information, a part of a solvable puzzle. For the person who lacks that conviction, that same loss is proof they were right to be cautious. It's a psychological justification for retreat. The true function of positive thinking isn't to ignore obstacles, but to ensure that when they arise, you remain in a resourceful state, capable of generating solutions rather than falling into the paralyzing despair that realism without optimism often brings. That resourcefulness is part of the sufficiency.
Okay, that emphasis on resourcefulness actually brings us to a key point. We need to structure that resourcefulness. We don't have to choose between belief and realism. We can integrate them. But for that integration to work, realism has to act as the cognitive bridge. There's a proven method, one that's far superior to pure unstructured positive thinking, that does exactly this. It's called mental contrasting with implementation intentions, but it's more widely known as WOOP.
Right, WOOP.
The method starts exactly where you champion it, the wish, visualizing the successful outcome. This gives you the motivation, but then it immediately introduces the corrective, identifying the major obstacles ahead. And then, crucially, the final step is creating a structured plan through what are called implementation intentions. This is the technical heart of why pure positive thinking is insufficient. An implementation intention is a concrete, if X happens, then I will do Y commitment. For our author, they don't just visualize the book. They plan. If I am tempted to watch TV tonight, then I will open my laptop and write 500 words. It turns a vague goal into an automated behavioral response.
And the research on WOOP confirms its effectiveness doesn't primarily come from the visualization. Its success is rooted in the realism of facing the obstacles and the behavioral rigor of locking in those plans. That commitment to realism is the necessary condition for turning the wish into a real outcome. You're taking that motivational energy and shaping it into effective effort.
I see why you're emphasizing the mechanics, I do. But I still maintain that you're describing an evolution of positive thinking, not an eradication of it. And you're overlooking the source of the fuel. You mentioned the wish component. That core positive vision, that central motivating belief, is still the fundamental starting point. It generates the psychological commitment to even do the WOOP process. The O and P steps, the obstacles and plan, they're only taken if the belief in the wish is strong enough to justify that hard work.
But is it enough?
I think so. Think of it this way. WOOP is the steering and the transmission, but the fervent belief system is the high-octane fuel that the engine runs on. If that foundational belief isn't strong enough to generate the wish with real conviction, the whole WOOP mechanism just becomes a sterile bureaucratic exercise. A person will just list obstacles they secretly believe they can't overcome, and the plans remain, bullet points on a piece of paper. The belief system is the core that allows the planning steps to be seen as manageable challenges, not insurmountable barriers.
That's a compelling defense, but it still doesn't address the danger of excessive, unstructured optimism. What about the concept of defensive pessimism? This shows us that people who are too optimistic often underperform precisely because their positive vision made them complacent. They visualize the success and they mentally check the box, assuming it's inevitable, without detailed planning. They skip the obstacles part of WOOP entirely. This just reinforces my position that realism is the necessary condition. We need to avoid that complacency. The optimism opens the door, yes, I'll grant you that, but the map and the keys, the rigorous planning, that's what gets you across the threshold and down the path. The excessive optimist just stands at the door admiring the view, convinced that seeing the destination is the same as having made the journey.
But that's exactly where the distinction lies. My argument is that if the belief is robust enough, it will compel the behavior. The cognitive dissonance of not acting on such a strong conviction becomes too great. If you truly believe the goal is possible, then failing to plan feels like a form of self-sabotage, which the optimist naturally resists. The sufficiency of the belief is that it generates the cognitive and behavioral machinery needed to execute the very strategy you're championing.
But the evidence shows a gap there. It shows that belief can lead to the delusion of sufficiency, where visualization replaces the action instead of generating it. The truly successful person isn't just the one who believes, but the one who can rigorously confront the reality of their own limitations and resource needs.
I think we've reached the heart of it, and our disagreement really does hinge on that word sufficiency.
I think you're right.
I maintain that positive thinking is the sufficient psychological engine. It provides the resilience, the interpretive framework, and the raw persistence needed to fuel all the required action. Without that foundational conviction, the maps and keys you champion, they're just inert knowledge, discarded at the first major setback. Belief is the precondition and the sustaining force.
And I maintain that internal conviction is a necessary motivator. But when you take it as sufficient alone, it invites complacency and the planning fallacy. For meaningful, measurable success, that internal driver has to be immediately paired with a rigorous, disciplined anticipation of external obstacles and realistic planning. Strategy acts as a necessary restraint against the self-deception that pure optimism can foster.
So what we've illuminated today, I think, is that anyone seeking a goal has to appreciate that mindset profoundly matters. It provides that critical initial push and the enduring capacity for effort.
Yet the true value seems to lie in how that powerful internal belief is balanced with the disciplined, realistic processing of external preparation and recognizing obstacles.
Absolutely. Appreciating both perspectives, the psychological core and the necessary external strategy, is clearly essential to fully understanding and effectively walking the very complex path toward achieving a goal.